What is the weight of a man's life? Is it measured in the ribbons pinned to his chest, the hash marks on his sleeve, the years etched into his face by sun and service? Or is it found in the silence that follows, the hollow space left behind when the parades are over and the uniforms are put away? The cold, hard truth of America is that honor has a price, and memory is a commodity. For some, a man's entire legacy can be bought for pennies on the dollar, sold in the dim, dusty corners of forgotten shops while the man himself fades away under the cold, indifferent hum of fluorescent lights. The room was a sterile box of white and beige. It smelled of antiseptic, bleach, and the faint, funereal scent of wilting flowers left on a windowsill. Machines beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm, the only percussion in the silent symphony of decline. In the center of the room, lost in a sea of starched white sheets, lay Sergeant Major Thomas Abernathy, United States Marine Corps, retired. He was a ghost haunting the shell of his own body. His skin, once tanned and toughened by the suns of a dozen forgotten hellholes from the Chosin Reservoir to the Mekong Delta, was now as thin and translucent as parchment. Blue veins traced intricate maps of suffering across his temples and the backs of his hands. His eyes, which had once held the flat, hard authority to command a battalion of young men to charge into the mouth of hell, were now clouded with a milky film of confusion and pain. They stared at the acoustic tile ceiling, seeing not the bland, perforated squares, but the faces of ghosts. His breathing was a shallow, ragged affair, each inhalation a tiny, desperate battle against the fluid filling his lungs. Pneumonia, the doctors called it. The old man's friend, they used to say, but Thomas Abernathy had never had any friends who were so cruel. His friends had been men with names like Gunny and Doc, men who smelled of cordite and camaraderie, who shared rations in frozen foxholes and bled alongside him in the suffocating jungle heat. This slow, suffocating presence in his chest was no friend. It was an enemy, the last in a long line of them, and this time he was losing the war. He drifted. Time had become a liquid thing, pooling and eddying without logic. One moment, he was back in Korea, the cold a living thing that gnawed at his bones, the air so frigid it felt like swallowing glass. He could see the face of his platoon sergeant, a craggy man from Tennessee, shouting orders that were swallowed by the wind and the roar of artillery. He could feel the familiar weight of his M1 Garand, its stock cold and solid against his cheek. Then, the scene would shift, melting like a film strip held too close to a bulb. He was in Vietnam, the air thick and wet, the jungle a suffocating green wall of life and death. The staccato chatter of an M60, the smell of mud and decay, the shouts of boys who were too young to be dying. Then, another shift, the happiest one. He was standing in a small church in North Carolina, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle drifting through the open windows. Before him stood Eleanor, her smile brighter than the summer sun, her eyes the color of the Carolina sky. He remembered the impossible softness of her hand in his, the crispness of his dress blues, the feeling that his heart was too big for his own chest. For 57 years, she had been his anchor, his port in the endless storm of memory. She was the one who understood the silence, the one who could see the ghosts in his eyes and not be afraid. But Eleanor was a ghost now, too. The cancer had taken her a year ago, a quiet, merciless thief that had stolen the light from his world. Her absence was a physical presence in his small, tidy house. It was in the empty space beside him in the bed, the second coffee cup that remained on the shelf, the silence where her laughter used to be. After she was gone, the other ghosts, the ones from the wars, had returned with a vengeance. He tried to hold on. He kept the house immaculate, just as she would have. He polished his metals once a week, the silver and bronze gleaming in the quiet afternoon light. The Navy Cross, the silver stars, the purple hearts with their oak leaf clusters. They weren't trophies of war. They were markers of survival, testaments to the men who hadn't come home. They were his history, his identity. They were all he had left of the man he once was. But loneliness was a cancer of its own. It ate at his resolve, eroded his discipline. The house became too quiet, the memories too loud. The bills started to pile up. His small pension and Social Security barely covered the mortgage and the property taxes that kept climbing. After Eleanor's medical expenses, his savings had been wiped out. He started selling things. A piece of furniture here, an old watch there. Each sale felt like a small surrender, another piece of his life with her chipped away. He was proud. He was a sergeant major of Marines. He didn't ask for help. He didn't complain. He tightened his belt, ate less, and turned the heat down until the house was perpetually cold. But his body, 86 years old and pushed past every conceivable limit, finally betrayed him. A fall in the kitchen, a neighbor finding him hours later, shivering and disoriented. And now this white room. The hospital was a different kind of prison. Here, his pride was stripped away with his clothes. He was no longer Sergeant Major Abernathy. He was the patient in 304B, a collection of symptoms on a chart, a problem to be managed. He was drowning, not just in the fluid in his lungs, but in medical debt, in forms he couldn't understand, in the crushing, impersonal weight of a system that had no room for honor. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook his frail frame. A spike of pain shot through his chest. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the featureless ceiling was replaced by Eleanor's face. "Just hold on, Tommy," she seemed to whisper. "Just a little longer." But he didn't know why he was holding on. There was nothing left to hold on for. The world he had built, the life he had earned, it was all turning to dust, slipping through his trembling fingers. Miles away, where the asphalt of civilization gave way to gravel and then to dirt, Jack Kellen stood on the porch of his cabin. The morning air was sharp and cold, tasting of pine and damp earth. It was a clean cold, not the sterile chill of a hospital. It was the cold of life, of a world that was raw and honest and unforgiving. He was a man built of hard lines and sharp angles, a human edifice carved from granite and resolve. He stood 6'3", with shoulders that seemed to strain the seams of his simple gray t-shirt. His body was a roadmap of a violent life, a dense topography of muscle overlaid with the pale, jagged lines of old scars. A long, thin scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a close-quarters argument in a dusty Fallujah marketplace. His hands were thick and calloused, weapons in themselves, but they rested gently on the worn railing of the porch. Jack Kellen, former Marine Force reconnaissance operator, Tier 1 asset, was a man hunting for silence. He had spent 15 years in the service of noise, the deafening roar of helicopter rotors, the crack of sniper fire, the concussive boom of IEDs, the screams of the wounded and the dying. He had lived and breathed in the cacophony of war. When he had finally come home, the external noise had stopped, but the internal noise had only grown louder. The silence he had sought in these remote mountains of Colorado was an illusion. It was a canvas onto which his memory painted its most brutal masterpieces. In the quiet, he heard the voice of his team leader, Gunnery Sergeant Elias Vance, a man he had loved like a brother. He heard the final, choked-off command, the eruption of gunfire, the sickening wet sound of impact. He saw the surprise in Eli's eyes, the light fading from them as he fell. Jack had been there. He had returned fire, eliminated the threat, but he hadn't been fast enough. A fraction of a second too slow. That fraction of a second was the ghost that haunted him, the specter that sat with him in the dark. He had come home with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts. He had tried to fit into the civilian world. He had tried the 9-to-5 jobs, the backyard barbecues, the polite, meaningless conversations. It felt like wearing a suit that was 3 sizes too small. He was a predator trying to pretend he was prey, a wolf in a field of sheep, and the effort was exhausting. The world was too loud, too soft, too complicated, and too simple all at once. He didn't fit. So he had retreated. He bought this cabin with his combat pay, a small fortress of solitude against a world he no longer understood. He chopped his own wood, hunted his own food, and spoke to almost no one. His routine was his armor. Up before dawn, a brutal workout that pushed his body to the breaking point. A long run through the woods. Then, the quiet labor of survival. It was a war of attrition against his own mind. A heavy head pressed against his thigh. He looked down into a pair of eyes that were old, intelligent, and held a deep, knowing sadness that mirrored his own. Havoc. The German Shepherd was massive, nearly 110 pounds of bone and muscle, his black and tan coat thick and coarse. A deep scar ran down the side of his snout, a souvenir from a bomb-maker's den in the Helmand province. One of his ears had a torn, ragged edge. Like Jack, Havoc was a veteran. He was a multi-purpose canine, an NPC who had served 3 tours sniffing out explosives, tracking high-value targets, and protecting his human teammates with a ferocity that was legendary. They had been paired together on Jack's last tour. They had been a single, seamless weapon system. Havoc was not a pet. He was a partner. He had saved Jack's life more times than he could count, his preternatural senses alerting them to hidden IEDs, to ambush positions, to the scent of fear on an enemy combatant hiding in the dark. In return, Jack had pulled Havoc from a collapsed building, shielding the dog with his own body as the rubble rained down, carrying him 2 miles back to the FOB. When Havoc was scheduled for retirement due to his injuries and what the vets called canine PTSD, Jack had moved heaven and earth to adopt him. The bureaucracy had been a nightmare, a different kind of war fought with paperwork and phone calls. But Jack had been relentless. He would not leave his brother behind. Now, they were 2 broken soldiers healing together in the quiet of the mountains. Havoc was his anchor. When the nightmares came, when Jack woke up thrashing in sweat-soaked sheets, the big dog would be there, pressing his heavy body against him, licking the sweat from his face, a living, breathing weight to pull him back from the abyss. He was the only creature on Earth who understood Jack's silence. But the silence wasn't enough. The solitude was becoming a prison of its own. He was healing his body, but his soul was still adrift. Eli's wife had told him, in their last tearful phone call, "You have to find a new mission, Jack, or the war will never end for you." He knew she was right, but he didn't know what that mission could be. He was a weapon, designed for a single, brutal purpose. A weapon without a war was just a useless, dangerous thing. 2 days a week, he broke his isolation. It was his penance, his attempt to reconnect with the world he had fought for. He and Havoc would drive the 90 minutes into the city, to the sprawling VA hospital. They were a registered therapy dog team. The idea had seemed absurd at first. Him, a man who radiated a do-not-approach aura, and Havoc, a scarred and intimidating war dog, bringing comfort to anyone. But the hospital administrators had seen his record, and Havoc's. They understood the power of a shared experience. Walking those long, sterile corridors was its own kind of patrol. He saw the ghosts of his past and the ghosts of his future in the faces of the men there. Old men from forgotten wars, young men fresh from the meat grinder, all of them carrying their own invisible wounds. He rarely spoke. He didn't need to. He would stand quietly in the doorway of a room, and Havoc would pad inside, his claws clicking softly on the linoleum. The big dog would rest his head on the edge of a bed, and a trembling, liver-spotted hand would reach out and stroke his fur. In those moments, Jack felt a flicker of something, a purpose. It wasn't a mission, not the kind he was used to. It was quieter, smaller, but it was something. It was a start. He finished his coffee, the last of it cold. He rinsed the mug in the sink and placed it carefully on the drying rack. "Time to go to work, buddy," he said, his voice a low rumble. Havoc's tail gave a single, solid thump against the wooden floorboards. He rose to his feet, his movements fluid and powerful. He was ready. He was always ready. They were going to the hospital. The VA hospital was a city unto itself, a sprawling campus of beige brick buildings connected by endless hallways that smelled of floor wax and quiet despair. It was a place of healing and a place of waiting. For many, it was the last stop. Jack navigated the labyrinthine corridors with the practiced economy of movement of a man used to clearing buildings. He kept his eyes forward, his gaze a neutral sweep, but he saw everything. He saw the young Marine in the wheelchair, his legs gone below the knee, his eyes 1,000 yards away, staring at a wall. He saw the old sailor with the oxygen tank, his chest covered in faded naval tattoos, telling a story to a nurse who was too busy to listen. He saw the loneliness, the pride, the pain. It was a museum of sacrifice. Havoc walked at his left heel, his official therapy dog vest on, a splash of color against his dark fur. The dog was a different animal here. His posture was less rigid, his ears softer. He seemed to understand the nature of this mission. It was not about finding bombs or hunting men. It was about finding pain and offering a moment of solace. They had a routine. They started on the 3rd floor, the long-term care ward. They moved from room to room. In some, a weary smile would greet them. A hand would reach for Havoc. In others, The occupants were too lost in their own worlds of pain or dementia to notice. Jack never pushed. He would stand for a moment, assess the situation, and move on. He was a silent observer, a sentinel. They were nearing the end of their rounds. Room 304B. The door was slightly ajar. Jack heard a voice from within, a voice that didn't belong to a doctor or a nurse. It was smooth, cultured, but with an undercurrent of impatience that set his teeth on edge. "And if you just sign here, Sergeant Major, we can finalize the appraisal. It's a very generous offer. You must understand. A gesture of my deep respect for your service." Jack paused in the hallway. Something in the tone was wrong. It was the predatory cadence of a salesman closing a deal, not the respectful tone one used with a dying man. At his side, Havoc stopped dead. The dog's body went rigid, the muscles in his powerful shoulders bunching. His head lowered slightly, his ears swiveling forward like twin radar dishes. A low growl, more a vibration than a sound, rumbled deep in his chest. It was a sound Jack knew well. It was the sound Havoc made when he detected a threat. Jack put a hand on Havoc's back, a silent command to hold. He moved to the doorway and looked inside. He saw the old man in the bed, frail and struggling for breath. His eyes were unfocused, his hand trembling as it lay on the blanket. Standing over him was a man in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Jack's truck. He was in his late 50s, with slicked-back silver hair, a manicured goatee, and a smile that was all teeth, like a shark. In one hand, he held a pen. In the other, a clipboard with a sheaf of papers. He was trying to press the pen into the old man's hand. "Come now, Thomas," the man said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Let's get this taken care of. You need to think about your legacy and your expenses." The old man, Sergeant Major Abernathy, shook his head weakly, a flicker of lucidity in his clouded eyes. "Eleanor," she said. "Never," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Eleanor would have wanted you to be practical." The man in the suit pressed, his smile tightening. "This is just a piece of metal, after all. Its true value is in what it can do for you now." He gestured around the bleak hospital room. "This place isn't cheap, Thomas." Jack's blood went cold. He saw what the man was gesturing towards. Not the room, but a small, velvet-lined box on the bedside table. Inside it, nestled against the dark fabric, was a simple blue ribbon holding a 5-pointed star. The Medal of Honor. Righteous fury, cold and pure, washed over Jack. It was an old, familiar feeling. It was the feeling he got when he saw a bully kick a dog, or a predator corner its prey. This man wasn't just a salesman. He was a vulture, circling a dying lion, trying to steal its teeth. Havoc felt the shift in Jack. The dog's low growl deepened, becoming an audible threat. He took a step forward, planting his feet firmly in the doorway. He was no longer a therapy dog. He was a sentinel. He was a weapon. He had assumed the vanguard stance, a posture that placed him between his handler and a perceived threat. He was a living, breathing barrier. The man in the suit, Julian Croft, finally noticed them. His head snapped up, his shark-like smile faltering as he took in the scene in the doorway. He saw a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain outside, his face a granite mask of cold rage. And he saw a dog that looked like a wolf from a nightmare, its lips curled back just enough to reveal a hint of white teeth, its eyes locked on him with an unnerving, predatory intelligence. "Can I help you?" Croft asked, trying to regain his smooth composure, but his voice was a fraction too high. "This is a private conversation." Jack didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He let the silence and the low growl from his dog do the talking. His eyes, the color of chipped flint, bored into Croft. "The conversation is over," Jack said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more menacing. Croft bristled, his arrogance battling his newfound fear. "I don't know who you think you are, but I am a guest of Mr. Abernathy. We are conducting business." "I think you're a ghoul," Jack replied, taking a single, deliberate step into the room. Havoc moved with him, a fluid shadow of menace. "And I think your business here is done." He looked past Croft, his gaze softening as it fell on the old man in the bed. He saw the terror and confusion in Sergeant Major Abernathy's eyes. He also saw the uniform, the lifetime of service, the honor that was being preyed upon. He looked back at Croft. "Walk away now," Jack commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. Croft looked from Jack's cold eyes to Havoc's bared teeth and back again. The predatory smile was gone, replaced by a mask of indignation and fear. He was a man accustomed to power, but his power was built on money and influence, on exploiting the weak. He was utterly unprepared for this kind of power, the raw, physical power of a warrior who had stepped out of a different, more brutal world. He hesitated for a second, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Havoc took another step forward, the growl now a chest-rattling snarl. Instinct 1. This is highly irregular. Croft sputtered, snatching his clipboard and the velvet box from the table. I'll be speaking with the hospital administration about this. And about this. Animal. He scurried out of the room, practically tripping over his own expensive shoes to get away from the silent man and his terrifying dog. He didn't look back. The tension in the room vanished with him. Jack let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He gave Havoc a quiet command. Stand down, boy. Easy. Havoc's posture softened. The growl subsided. He looked up at Jack, then walked over to the hospital bed. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a formidable creature, he rested his massive head on the edge of the mattress, right next to the old Marine's trembling hand. Sergeant Major Abernathy's clouded eyes cleared for a moment. He looked at Havoc, then at Jack. A single tear traced a path through the weathered landscape of his cheek. He tried to take it. Abernathy whispered, his voice cracking. My medal. Jack walked to the bedside. He looked down at the old warrior, this man who had faced down enemy armies, who had bled for his country on 3 continents, now being brought to tears by a parasite in a suit. The cold fury in Jack's chest began to solidify, to sharpen into something else. A purpose. He didn't take it, Sergeant Major, Jack said, his voice softer now. And he won't. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. He wasn't going anywhere. Havoc, as if sensing the shift, let out a soft sigh and lay down on the floor, his body pressed against the base of the bed, a furry, vigilant guardian. He, too, seemed to understand. The mission had begun. Jack didn't leave. The nurses came and went, checking Abernathy's vitals, changing his drip. They initially looked at Jack with suspicion, another silent, imposing man in a room full of them. But they saw the therapy dog vest on Havoc, and they saw the way the big dog refused to leave the bedside, his presence a calming, solid anchor in the sterile room. They saw the way Abernathy's heart rate, displayed on the monitor above the bed, had stabilized for the first time in days. It was still erratic, but the frantic peaks and valleys had smoothed out. One nurse, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes named Maria, paused by the door. He seems calmer with your dog here, she said quietly. We've never seen anything like it. He's a good dog, Jack replied, his eyes not leaving the old Marine. The man who was here earlier, Maria continued, lowering her voice. Mr. Croft. He's been coming around for weeks. Calls himself a friend of the veterans, an appraiser from the Patriot Legacy Foundation. Some of the men, they've sold him things. Things that meant a lot to them, she wrung her hands. It never felt right. Jack's jaw tightened. So it was a pattern, a system. Croft wasn't just an opportunist. He was a professional predator. He stayed through the afternoon and into the evening. Havoc didn't move, except to drink from a small bowl of water Jack provided. The dog was a statue of loyalty, a living testament to a bond that transcended words. He seemed to understand that his duty here was absolute. The prompt from the news story echoed in Jack's mind. Service dog wouldn't leave the hospital bed. It wasn't just a story. It was a reality playing out before his eyes. Havoc had identified his charge, and he would not be relieved of duty. As Abernathy drifted in and out of a restless, medicated sleep, he would occasionally murmur. Names of men Jack didn't know. Places he had only read about in history books. And Eleanor's name, over and over, like a prayer. During a brief moment of lucidity, his trembling hand found Havoc's head, his fingers tangling in the thick fur. Good boy, the sergeant major whispered. Good boy, you stand your post. Abernathy's other hand, lying on his chest, was clutching something. Jack hadn't noticed it before. It was a crumpled piece of paper. With the gentle care of a bomb disposal expert, Jack slowly, carefully worked the paper from the old man's weak grasp. He didn't want to disturb him, but he knew it could be important. He smoothed it out. It was a receipt. A carbon copy, flimsy and thin. At the top, in an elegant, flowing script, were the words Croft Antiquities and Historical Artifacts. Below that was an item description. 1-1, cased military decoration, U.S. Army issue, with ribbon, and next to it, the price. $500. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the receipt, then at the empty velvet box on the bedside table. U.S. Army issue? Croft was not only a thief, but an ignorant one. This wasn't just any decoration. It was the Medal of Honor, awarded to Abernathy for actions during the Battle of Inchon, where as a young corporal, he had single-handedly charged 3 enemy machine gun nests, saving his entire platoon. There were collectors who would pay upwards of $100,000 for a medal of that significance and provenance. Even to a legitimate dealer, its historical value was immense. $500 wasn't an offer. It was a profound insult. It was the price of a used television. This receipt was the clue. It was the shell casing at a crime scene. It was the first thread. He pulled out his phone, a ruggedized piece of tech that looked as tough as he did. He took a high-resolution photo of the receipt, making sure every word was crystal clear. Then he opened a secure messaging app, the icon a simple black square. He selected a single contact from a list of 2. The name was just one word, Spectre. He attached the image and typed a short message. Run it. Julian Croft. Croft Antiquities. Full workup. I want everything. Financials, connections, known associates. He's a predator targeting vets. This one was for a Medal of Honor. For $500. He hit send. The message encrypted itself and vanished. For a moment, there was no reply. Jack knew how Spectre worked. The man, a former Army signals intelligence analyst who had lost both his legs to an IED outside of Solder City, lived in a basement in San Diego that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. He was a ghost in the machine, a digital phantom who could walk through any firewall and peel back any layer of corporate or personal security. He was the tech oracle of their small, broken brotherhood of forgotten warriors. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed. On it. This is dirty, Jack. Real dirty. Give me an hour. Jack put the phone away. An hour. In that hour, Spectre would unleash a digital whirlwind. He would peel back Julian Croft's life layer by layer, exposing every dirty secret, every hidden account, every cowardly transaction. He looked back at the sergeant major, his breathing still shallow, his face a mask of weary struggle. He thought about the man's life, the battles fought, the sacrifices made. He thought about the honor embodied in that small metal star, an honor Croft had tried to purchase for the price of a cheap suit. The cold fury returned, but now it was different. It was focused. It had a target. He had spent years trying to bury the warrior inside him, to silence the instincts that had kept him alive in the darkest places on Earth. Now, he was letting the warrior out. He was sharpening his senses, focusing his rage into a single, pointed purpose. He was no longer just a man visiting a hospital. He was a hunter, and he had found his prey. The hour passed in silence, marked only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Jack sat perfectly still, a study in contained energy. He was doing what he did best, observing, waiting, planning. He analyzed the layout of the room, the hallway, the hospital wing. He noted the nurses' schedules, the security guards' patrol route. His mind, trained for combat, was turning the hospital into a battle space, identifying assets, threats, and exit routes. It was an automatic process, a switch that had been flipped back on. His phone buzzed again, a series of rapid vibrations. It was Spectre. Jack opened the secure app. It wasn't a message. It was a data dump, a torrent of files, links, and encrypted documents. At the top was a summary from Spectre. Jack, you were right. This guy is a bottom feeder of the lowest order. Julian Croft, age 58, owner of Croft Antiquities, also the sole board member of a nonprofit called the Patriot Legacy Foundation. It's his cover. Jack's eyes narrowed as he read. Spectre had laid it all out. The foundation gives him access to VA hospitals and nursing homes all over the state under the guise of veteran outreach and historical preservation. He gets lists of patients, especially those in long-term care, those with cognitive decline, and those with no immediate family. He targets the most vulnerable. The report was chillingly detailed. Spectre had hacked into Croft's business servers and his personal accounts. He had found everything. His MO is consistent. He finds a vet with valuable memorabilia, medals, presentation firearms, captured flags, battlefield souvenirs. He researches their financial situation. If they're struggling, he moves in. He uses the foundation to build trust, then offers to appraise their items. The appraisals are always insultingly low. He preys on their confusion, their desperation, their pride. He makes them feel like he's doing them a favor, helping them with their burdensome expenses. There was more. Spectre had cross-referenced sales from Croft's gallery with a list of recent patients at several VA facilities. The pattern was undeniable. A silver star from a Vietnam vet in hospice, bought for $200, sold at auction a month later for $15,000. A captured German Luger from a World War II hero with dementia, bought for $300, sold to a private collector in Germany for $25,000. The list went on and on. It was a systematic plundering of honor, a strip mining of American history for personal profit. He's not just a ghoul, Jack. He's a hyena. He's made millions doing this. I've found offshore accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland. He's meticulous. He keeps 2 sets of books. One for the IRS, showing modest profits and charitable donations. And another one, a private encrypted ledger on a firewalled server in his office. I'm in it now. A new file appeared on Jack's phone. It was a spreadsheet. It contained names, dates, items, purchase prices, and final sale prices. There were over 200 names on the list. 200 veterans. 200 lives pillaged. Besides some names, Spectre had added a note, deceased. Jack felt a wave of nausea. This was worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't just theft. It was a desecration. It was a violation of a sacred trust. Each name on that list was a man like Sergeant Major Abernathy, a man who had given everything and was now having the last vestiges of his dignity stolen from him as he lay dying. The final message from Spectre was what pushed Jack over the edge. Jack, Abernathy's medal. It's not on the public market, but I found encrypted emails between Croft and a private buyer in Dubai, a sheik who collects high-level U.S. military decorations. The asking price is $250,000. The deal is supposed to close tomorrow. Croft picked up the medal today, but Abernathy hadn't signed the final transfer of ownership. That's what he was trying to do when you walked in. He doesn't have legal title yet, but he has physical possession. The horrifying revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Croft had the medal. He had walked out of the room with a $250,000 piece of American valor that he had tried to swindle for $500. And he was planning to sell it overseas, where it would disappear into a private collection forever. The warrior inside Jack, the one he had tried to suppress, did not just wake up. It exploded. The cold fury became white-hot plasma. The world narrowed down to a single point, a single objective. This was no longer about scaring a man away. This was about retribution. This was about justice. The kind of justice that didn't come from a courtroom or a legal filing. The kind of justice that he had been trained to deliver. He stood up. The movement was sudden, violent. Havoc was instantly on his feet, sensing the change in his handler. The dog looked up at him, his intelligent eyes asking the question. Jack looked at the nurse, Maria, who was at the nurse's station down the hall. He walked over to her. "I have to leave," he said, his voice low and tight. "But my dog will not. Can you make sure he has water? Do not try to move him. He will not leave that bedside." Maria looked at the intensity in Jack's eyes, then at the resolute German shepherd standing guard by the door of 304B. She saw something in Jack's face that made her nod without question. "Of course. We'll look after him. Is everything all right?" "It will be," Jack said. He placed a hand on Havoc's head. The dog whined softly, not wanting him to go. "Stay," Jack commanded, his voice firm. "Watch him. It's your only duty." Havoc seemed to understand. He gave Jack's hand a quick lick, then turned and padded back into the room, resuming his vigil at the foot of the bed. A silent promise. "I will not fail this duty." Jack turned and walked away, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't look back. He moved through the hospital corridors not like a visitor, but like a predator on the hunt. The quiet, broken man who had entered the VA hours ago was gone. In his place was Recon Marine Jack Kellen, Tier 1 operator, and he was going to war. The drive from the hospital to his cabin was a blur of asphalt and fury. He didn't notice the scenery or the other cars. His mind was a whirlwind of tactical planning. He reread Spectre's data dump, memorizing the layout of Croft's gallery, the security schematic Spectre had pulled from the installer's database, the location of the back office where the private server was kept. He arrived at his cabin as dusk was bleeding into night. The woods were dark and silent. He didn't turn on the lights. He moved through the familiar space by touch and memory. He went to a heavy-duty steel footlocker at the base of his bed. It wasn't locked with a key. It had a biometric scanner. He placed his thumb on the pad. It beeped once, and the heavy lid hissed open. Inside was the other Jack Kellen, the one he kept locked away. It wasn't a cache of firearms. He didn't need them for this. This was about a different kind of warfare. He pulled out a set of black tactical pants, a form-fitting black shirt made of a moisture-wicking synthetic fiber, and a pair of soft-soled boots that were designed for stealth. He changed quickly, his movements economical and efficient. He didn't need a gun. He was the weapon, but he did select a few tools of his trade. A slim, carbon fiber pry bar, a set of sophisticated lock picks, a small, powerful LED flashlight with a strobe function, and strapped to his forearm, a K-bar TDI law enforcement knife, its blade short, sharp, and designed for close-quarters work. It was a tool of last resort, but he believed in being prepared. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. The man staring back was a stranger and yet deeply familiar. His eyes were cold, his face an impassive mask. This was the face he wore when he went to work. The face of the hunter. He sent one last message to Spectre. Address for Croft Antiquities. The reply was instant. A blue pin dropped on a map. It was in the city's wealthiest district, a street lined with art galleries, designer boutiques, and high-end restaurants. A world away from the bleakness of the VA hospital. The contrast fueled his rage. I'm going in, Jack typed. Maintain comms. Be my eyes. Roger that, Spectre replied. I'm inside their security network now. The system is armed. 2 motion sensors in the main gallery, pressure plate under the rug at the front door, magnetic contact on all doors and windows. Back office has a separate keypad lock. I'll handle it. You just walk. Go dark. Jack put the phone in his pocket and walked out of the cabin, melting into the night. He got into his truck, the engine rumbling to life with a low growl that seemed to echo his own mood. The drive back to the city was different this time. He was no longer running from the noise. He was bringing it. He drove with a calm, focused intensity, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He was moving toward the X, the point of conflict, and for the first time in years, it felt right. It felt like coming home. He parked 3 blocks away from the gallery, in a dark alley. He got out of the truck and moved through the shadows, a ghost in the urban landscape. The air here smelled of exhaust fumes and expensive perfume, a cloying, artificial scent that grated on his senses. He found the gallery. Croft Antiquities. The storefront was dark, a wrought iron gate pulled across the front door. The display window was artfully lit, showcasing a collection of Civil War swords and a pristine Revolutionary War musket. It was a tomb of stolen history, a monument to greed. He didn't go to the front. He slipped into the alley that ran alongside the building. It was dark and narrow, smelling of garbage and stale beer. At the end of the alley was a solid steel door. The back entrance. According to Spectre's schematic, this was his entry point. His phone buzzed. A message from Spectre. Motion sensors disabled. Door contact bypassed. The deadbolt is yours. Jack pulled out his picks. His hands, which could crush a man's throat, moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon. He inserted the tension wrench, applying the slightest pressure. He slid the pick into the lock, his fingers reading the faint clicks as the pins aligned. It was a language he was fluent in. One by one, the pins fell into place. 30 seconds later, he felt the core of the lock give way. He turned the wrench, and the deadbolt slid back with a soft, satisfying snick. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and slipped inside, as silent as the shadows he now occupied. He was in a small, cluttered stockroom. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old paper, wood polish, and something else, the faint, metallic tang of avarice. He drew his flashlight, but didn't turn it on. He let his eyes adjust to the gloom, his senses reaching out, tasting the air, listening to the building. He heard the low hum of a computer, the buzz of a refrigerator, and he heard a voice. It was Croft's voice, coming from the front of the building. He was on the phone, his tone smug and self-satisfied. Yes, Your Excellency, the provenance is impeccable. Of course, it is the genuine article. I have it in my possession now. A masterpiece of American heroism. It will be the jewel of your collection. The transfer will be made in the morning. A pleasure doing business with you. Croft laughed, a short, ugly bark. Jack followed the sound, moving through the darkened gallery like a phantom. The main room was filled with glass cases, each one a coffin for a piece of someone's life. He saw medals, uniforms, letters yellowed with age. Each one represented a story, a sacrifice, and Croft had stolen them all. He found the back office. The door was ajar. Through the crack, he could see Julian Croft sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He was holding the Medal of Honor, turning it over and over in his soft, manicured hands, admiring it like a piece of jewelry. A glass of expensive-looking scotch sat at his elbow. He looked like a king on his throne, gloating over his hoard. Jack's phone buzzed one last time. Office keypad disabled. The stage is yours. Give him hell. Jack pushed the door open. It swung inward without a sound. He stepped into the doorway, filling the frame, a dark silhouette against the light of the gallery. Croft looked up from the medal, his self-satisfied smirk still on his face. The smirk dissolved as he saw the figure in the doorway. His eyes widened. It was the man from the hospital, the man with the dog. But he looked different now. Harder, more dangerous. The casual clothes were gone, replaced by tactical black. His face was a mask of cold, implacable judgment. Who the hell are you? Croft stammered, scrambling to his feet, knocking his chair over in his haste. How did you get in here? I'm calling the police. Jack took a step into the room, and the door swung shut behind him, clicking softly. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden, tense silence. The police will come, Jack said, his voice a low, chilling monotone. But I get to talk to you first. Croft's face, which had been flushed with scotch and self-satisfaction, was now pale with terror. The arrogance that had defined him was a thin, brittle veneer, and it had just been shattered by the appearance of a ghost from his past, a ghost he thought he had left behind in that sterile hospital room. He was a predator who had just come face to face with an apex predator, and his world was about to be torn apart. I don't know what you want, Croft stammered, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape route. There was none. Jack blocked the only door. If it's money, take it. Take whatever you want. Jack let the silence hang in the air, a weapon in itself. He took another slow, deliberate step into the office. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The mahogany desk, the leather-bound books lining the walls, the framed historical documents. He saw the open laptop on the desk, the private ledger Spectre had mentioned visible on the screen. And he saw the Medal of Honor, lying on the green desk blotter where Croft had dropped it. You have a lot of names in your book, Croft, Jack said, his voice as cold and hard as a glacier. 217, to be exact. Men who fought for this country. Men who bled for it. Croft's face went from pale to ashen. He knew. Somehow, this man knew everything. The carefully constructed walls of his secret empire were crumbling. I don't know what you're talking about, he blustered, but his voice was thin and reedy, devoid of conviction. Jack's lips curled into something that was not a smile. It was a shark-like baring of teeth, a promise of violence. Let me refresh your memory. Sergeant Robert Miller. Vietnam. Silver Star. You bought it for $200. You sold it for 15,000 inch. He took another step. Corporal David Chun. Korean War. 2 Purple Hearts. You paid his nursing home bill for 1 month. $800. You sold them to a collector in Japan for 10,000 inch. He took another step. He was halfway to the desk now. And Sergeant Major Thomas Abernathy. United States Marine Corps. Medal of Honor. You tried to steal it from him while he was dying. You offered him $500. Jack was now standing directly in front of the desk. He leaned forward, placing his scarred, calloused hands flat on the polished mahogany. The wood seemed to groan under the pressure. He was a mountain of righteous fury, and Croft was a small, terrified man cowering in his shadow. You're not a businessman, Jack snarled, his voice dropping to a guttural whisper. You're a parasite. You feed on the weak, on the honorable. You take their legacy, the last thing they have in this world, and you melt it down into cash. Please, Croft whimpered, his bravado completely gone, replaced by a sniveling, pathetic fear. He was shrinking in on himself, trying to make himself smaller. It's just business. They needed the money. I was helping them. Helping them. Jack's voice was laced with disbelief and contempt. You were robbing their graves before they were even in them. Jack reached across the desk and picked up the Medal of Honor. He held it in his palm, the metal cool against his skin. He handled it with a reverence that was a stark contrast to Croft's casual avarice. This was not a commodity. It was a sacred object. It represented a moment of impossible bravery, a sacrifice that men like Croft could never comprehend. He then looked at the laptop, at the spreadsheet of stolen honor. "Spectre," he said into the quiet room. "You listening?" A tinny voice emanated from his phone's speaker. "Loud and clear, brother. I've got it all. Every transaction, every offshore account number. This pig is cooked." Croft looked at the phone in horror, as if it were a venomous snake. The disembodied voice confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just one man. It was an operation. He was caught in a net he couldn't see. "Now," Jack said, his attention returning to the terrified antique dealer. "We're going to fix this. You and I. We're going to have a little charity drive. The Julian Croft Repentance Fund." He gestured to the chair. "Sit." Croft stumbled back into his chair, his legs barely holding him up. "Open your banking software," Jack commanded. "All of it. The domestic accounts. The ones in the Caymans. The one in Zurich. Open it all. Now." Trembling, Croft's fingers fumbled with the mouse. He logged into his primary business account. The balance was obscene, millions of dollars sitting there, a liquid monument to his greed. "Spectre, you have the list," Jack said. "Give me the first name and the amount." "Sergeant Robert Miller." Spectre's voice came back instantly. "Sale price, $15,000. Plus a 25% punitive fee for being a scumbag. Total, $18,750. I'm sending you the account info for his widow now." A text message dinged on Jack's phone. He showed the screen to Croft. "You heard him. Wire transfer. $18,750. To this account. Put restitution in the memo line." "I can't," Croft pleaded. "A transfer that large will be flagged. My bank will call." Jack leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Make the transfer, or I will transfer your head from your shoulders. Do you understand me?" The raw, primal threat in Jack's voice cut through Croft's last shred of resistance. With shaking hands, he initiated the wire transfer. He had to go through two-factor authentication, his phone buzzing with a confirmation code. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely type the numbers in. Finally, he hit confirm. "Done," Spectre's voice said a moment later. "The transfer is complete. She'll have it in the morning." Next, for the next 2 hours, Jack stood over Julian Croft and systematically dismantled his financial empire. One by one, Spectre fed him the names and the amounts. One by one, Jack forced Croft to send the money back. Not the paltry sums he had paid, but the full, obscene profits he had made, plus the punitive fee. It was a slow, torturous process for Croft. With each transfer, he watched his fortune, his life's work of thievery, dwindle away. He was forced to liquidate stocks, to pull from offshore havens, to drain every account dry. Jack made him read each name aloud before sending the money. "Corporal David Chun," Croft would mumble. "Louder," Jack would command. "Corporal David Chun." It was a litany of his sins, a forced confession spoken to the ghost in the machine and the angel of vengeance standing before him. He cried. He begged. He pleaded. Jack was unmoved. His face remained a mask of cold, hard justice. He was not just taking the man's money. He was taking his power, his arrogance, his very identity. He was leaving him with nothing but the truth of what he was, a small, pathetic thief. Finally, they reached the last name on the list. The total amount transferred was staggering, well over $7 million. Croft's accounts were now a wasteland. "That's the last of them," Spectre said. "The accounts are drained. He's broke." Croft slumped in his chair, a broken man. He was sobbing openly now, pathetic, gasping breaths. "We're not done," Jack said. He pointed to the private ledger on the desk and the computer's hard drive. "That's evidence." He walked over to the server rack in the corner of the room, yanked the hard drive from its housing, and placed it on the desk next to the physical ledger. "This all goes to the authorities." He then made another call. this one to a number he knew by heart. It was a burner phone, answered on the second ring. "Yeah, it's me," Jack said. "I have a package for you. A gift-wrap case for the FBI's white-collar division. A predator named Julian Croft. He's been targeting veterans for years. I have a full confession, meticulous records, and a list of every victim. I've also recovered their funds." The voice on the other end, a former Army Ranger who now worked high-level federal cases, was quiet for a moment. "Off the books, I assume." "Completely," Jack confirmed. "Where's the package? And the suspect?" "I'll leave the evidence in a drop box at the corner of 5th and Elm." As for the suspect, Jack looked down at the weeping man in the chair. "He's at his gallery, Croft Antiquities. He's having a very bad night and is extremely motivated to cooperate fully with any and all federal investigations." "Understood," the ranger said. "We'll take it from here. Stay clean, Jack." "Always," Jack said, and ended the call. His work was almost done. He looked at Croft, a pathetic, quivering mass of ruined greed. Jack felt no pity, only a cold, clean satisfaction. He hadn't killed him. He had done something worse. He had taken his world, his status, his money, and left him naked for the justice system to devour. He had neutralized the threat. He carefully wrapped the Medal of Honor in a soft cloth he found on the desk and tucked it into a pocket. He gathered the hard drive and the ledger. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Croft. "When they ask you what happened," Jack said, his voice flat and final, "tell them the ghosts of everyone you ever robbed came to collect. And they sent me." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Julian Croft alone in the ruins of his life. He slipped out the back door and into the alley, melting back into the shadows from which he had come. The hunter's work was done. The night had been paid in full. Jack moved through the sleeping city, a silent wraith on a final mission. He dropped the package of evidence, the ledger and the hard drive, into the designated dead drop location, a prearranged postal box. His FBI contact would have it within the hour. The wheels of official justice, slow and cumbersome, would now begin to turn. But the real justice, the swift and personal kind, was already complete. He drove not to his cabin, but back to the hospital. The first light of dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale rose. The city was still quiet, holding its breath before the chaos of a new day. He walked back into the VA, the building now quiet and still, the overnight staff moving with a hushed weariness. He returned to the third floor, to room 304B. As he approached, he saw that the door was still ajar. He looked inside. Havoc was exactly where he had left him, a steadfast sentinel at the foot of the bed. The nurse, Maria, was in the room, checking the foredrip. She looked up as Jack entered, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. She gestured toward the heart monitor above the bed. The line, which had been a frantic, erratic scribble the day before, was now tracing a slow, steady, rhythmic peak and valley. It was the beat of a heart that was fighting, a heart that had found a reason to keep going. "His fever broke about an hour ago," Maria whispered, her voice full of wonder. "His breathing is deeper. He's resting, truly resting, for the first time since he came in. The doctor is amazed. He said it's like the dog willed him to live." Jack looked at Havoc, who lifted his head and gave a soft whine, his tail thumping once against the floor. The big dog had held his post. He had completed his mission. And then Jack saw the sergeant major. Thomas Abernathy's eyes were open, and they were clear. The milky film of confusion was gone. He was weak, exhausted, but he was lucid. He looked at Jack, and then his gaze fell upon Havoc. "He stayed," Abernathy whispered, his voice raspy but clear. "All night, like a guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier." Jack pulled the chair back to the bedside and sat down. He didn't say anything about Croft, about the money, about the night of retribution. The old warrior didn't need the details of the battle, only the news of the victory. He reached into his pocket and took out the cloth-wrapped object. He carefully unwrapped it and held it out. The Medal of Honor gleamed in the dim morning light of the hospital room. "This is yours, Sergeant Major," Jack said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Tears welled in Abernathy's eyes as he looked at the medal, then back at Jack. He understood, without needing to be told, that a great battle had been fought on his behalf. He slowly, shakily, reached out his hand and took it. His fingers closed around the familiar star, the anchor of his identity, the testament to his life. How? Abernathy asked, his voice choked. Jack simply nodded toward the German shepherd who was now resting his head back on the mattress. Havoc had a problem with the man who took it. And I have a problem with anyone Havoc has a problem with. Abernathy let out a weak chuckle, which turned into a cough. But it was a strong cough, a productive one. It was the sound of life, of lungs clearing. He held the metal to his chest, a look of profound peace settling over his weary features. A man needs his honor, the old Marine said. It's all he has in the end. You gave me mine back. Jack just nodded, unable to speak. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the feeling of a mission accomplished. Not for his country, not for a command, but for one man. For one brother in arms. The ghosts in his head were quiet. They were watching, but they were silent, respectful. For the first time, he felt not their judgment, but their approval. He stayed with the sergeant major for the rest of the morning, two warriors, one old and one young, sharing a silent understanding. Havoc dozed at their feet, his duty done, but his presence a constant, reassuring weight. The new beginning had started, not with a bang, but with a quiet, steady heartbeat in a sterile hospital room. The news of Julian Croft's arrest was a small item on the back page of the business section a week later. The story was dry, clinical. A prominent antique dealer arrested on federal fraud charges. Allegations of a complex scheme targeting elderly veterans. An anonymous tip led to the investigation. The FBI spokesman noted that, in a highly unusual turn of events, full restitution had already been made to all known victims before the arrest. Croft, his fortune gone and his reputation destroyed, had confessed to everything. He was facing decades in prison. But in the veteran community, another story was being told. A story whispered in the halls of VA hospitals, in the smoky rooms of VFW posts, and on the encrypted forums where warriors gathered online. It was the story of a ghost, a righteous wraith who had descended upon a predator and forced him to pay his debts. It was the story of millions of dollars suddenly appearing in the bank accounts of widows and forgotten heroes. It was the story of a Medal of Honor returned to its rightful owner. No one knew his name. They called him the Sentinel, or the Collector, but everyone knew the story began with a war dog who refused to leave a dying Marine's bedside. Sergeant Major Thomas Abernathy recovered with a speed that baffled his doctors. With his honor restored and his financial burdens miraculously lifted, a large, anonymous deposit had appeared in his bank account, enough to pay off his mortgage and all his debts with plenty to spare. His will to live had returned with a vengeance. The old Marine fire was back in his eyes. 2 months after Jack had walked into his hospital room, Abernathy walked out of the VA on his own 2 feet, leaning on a cane, but standing tall. Jack and Havoc were there to meet him. Jack drove him not to his old, empty house, but to a small, clean, respectable home in a quiet neighborhood that Abernathy had bought with his restored funds. It had a small yard and a porch with a rocking chair. That evening, the 2 men sat on the porch as the sun went down, painting the sky in fiery colors. Havoc lay at their feet, his head on Jack's boot. "What you did, son," Abernathy said, breaking the comfortable silence. He had the Medal of Honor, polished to a brilliant shine, in a display case on the small table between them. "It wasn't just for me. The phone calls have been coming in. From all over. Men I served with 50 years ago. Widows of men from your wars. They all have the same story. A wolf was at their door, and then, suddenly, he was gone, and their flock was whole again." Jack stared out at the horizon, at the mountains that had once been his refuge and his prison. Croft was a symptom. The disease is still out there. There are other wolves. Abernathy nodded, his expression grim. "That there are. Which is why I have a proposition for you." He leaned forward, the old fire of a command briefing in his eyes. "What we had, in the core, was a brotherhood. We looked out for our own. That's been lost. We're scattered, isolated. Easy targets." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You and I," he continued, "and that ghost in the machine you work with, we could be the start of something. Not a foundation that preys on people, but a real one. A watchdog. A fire team. We find the wolves, and we protect the flock. We become the brotherhood we've been missing." Jack turned to look at the old sergeant major. He saw not a frail old man, but a commander issuing a call to arms. He was offering Jack what he had been searching for, what Eli's wife had told him he needed to find. A new mission. It wasn't a war of bullets and bombs, but a war of shadows and information, of protection and justice. It was a mission that wouldn't create more ghosts, but would instead honor the ones he already carried. Jack looked down at Havoc, who looked back up at him, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the gravity of the moment. He then looked back at the sergeant major, the old warrior and the young warrior, 2 generations of the same tribe. A slow smile, a real one, spread across Jack's face for the first time in years. It felt foreign, but right. "Where do we start, Sergeant Major?" he asked. 6 months later. The house was quiet, filled with the warm, lazy light of a late afternoon. The scent of fresh brewed coffee and old books filled the air. It was a home, not just a house. It was a place of peace, a headquarters. In what used to be the dining room, a bank of computer monitors glowed, displaying lines of code, satellite maps, and financial data streams. Spectre had relocated from his San Diego basement. He had a new command center, and a new purpose that went beyond digital mischief. He was the eyes and ears of the Sentinel program, as they had come to call it. Sergeant Major Thomas Abernathy sat at the head of the table, a phone to his ear. He was no longer a victim. He was a general, his voice calm and authoritative as he spoke to the widow of an Army Ranger who was being harassed by an unscrupulous insurance company. He was their rock, their wise counsel, the living embodiment of the honor they fought to protect. And Jack Kellen stood on the porch, looking out at the setting sun. He wasn't hunting for silence anymore. He had found a different kind of quiet, a quiet that came not from the absence of noise, but from the presence of purpose. The restless energy that had plagued him for years was gone, replaced by a calm, steady resolve. Havoc was at his side, his body pressed against Jack's leg. The big dog was older now, his muzzle flecked with gray, but his eyes were bright and alert. He was no longer just a broken soldier, either. He was a guardian, a partner, the heart of their unique little squad. Jack rested his hand on the dog's massive head, his fingers stroking the familiar coarse fur, feeling the solid, living warmth. He thought of the journey that had brought him here. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the sterile halls of the VA, from the darkness of his own mind to this peaceful porch. It had all started with a dog who refused to give up on a dying man. A dog who had, in turn, saved them all. The ghosts were still there. They always would be. But they no longer haunted him. They stood with him now, a silent honor guard, their presence a reminder not of what he had lost, but of what he was fighting to protect. He had a brotherhood. He had a mission. The war was not over, but he was no longer fighting it alone. He was home,